Good morning, everybody. It's August 9th, 2026. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from. So there's a weather story breaking right now that the National Hurricane Center is watching extremely closely, and it could end up being the most consequential development of the entire Atlantic hurricane season so far. Two separate areas of disturbed weather have just been designated off the coast of Africa, and at least one of them has real potential to grow into something big over the next 7 to 10 days. We're going to talk about exactly where these systems are sitting right now, how they're expected to develop, why this particular stretch of ocean between Africa and the Caribbean has produced some of the most devastating storms in modern history, and why, even in a year that forecasters are calling quiet, it genuinely does not matter because it only takes one storm making landfall in the wrong place to turn an entire season into a catastrophe. We're also going to break down the bizarre split screen happening on planet Earth right now, where the Atlantic is being suppressed by a monster El Nino while the Western Pacific is on fire with one of the most active typhoon stretches in years. And stick around for the global roundup section, because there's a storm currently battering East Asia that already reached the equivalent of Category 5 strength, and there's a flooding disaster unfolding in Southeast Asia that most people outside the region have no idea is happening. So let's get into it. Right now, satellite imagery shows a tropical wave still sitting over West Africa, but it's expected to push off the coast and out over open Atlantic water on Tuesday, August 11th. When you look at the wind shear map meteorologists are tracking, there's a very specific detail that stands out. There's a pocket right off the African coast where the shear is low, almost non-existent, and that's exactly the kind of gap a tropical system needs to organize. Wind shear is basically the enemy of every hurricane in its infancy. It's a change in wind speed and direction as you go up in altitude, and if that shear is strong enough, it will physically tear a storm apart before it ever gets the chance to spin up. It tilts the center, it rips the thunderstorms away from the low-level circulation, and leaves nothing but a disorganized smear of clouds on the satellite. So when forecasters see a blank spot on that shear map, that's the signal that something might actually survive out there long enough to matter. The National Hurricane Center has already tagged two separate areas to watch. The first one, sitting a few hundred miles southwest of the Cabo Verde Islands, is being called Tropical Disturbance 1. And right now, the formation odds on that one are considered low, up around 20% over the next 7 days. The second system, the one still sitting back over the African continent and set to emerge Tuesday, is being given a slightly better shot. And forecasters expect gradual development to be possible through the middle to latter part of next week, as it tracks westward across the central Atlantic. If either of these organizes into a tropical depression and then strengthens further, it becomes the third named storm of the season, and there's already a name sitting on the list waiting for it. Now here's the thing you need to understand about a tropical wave. Because it's not a wave in the ocean, it's a wave in the atmosphere. It's a pulse of converging wind and thunderstorm activity that rolls off the African continent every few days during hurricane season, kind of like a heartbeat coming out of the Sahara. Most of these waves die a quiet death over open water, and nobody ever hears about them. But every single major hurricane that has ever devastated the Caribbean or the US Gulf Coast, the ones with names people still remember decades later, all started as exactly this. A little pulse of disturbed weather 1,000 miles off the coast of Senegal that nobody was paying attention to yet. That's what makes this moment interesting. Right now, what we're looking at is genuinely nothing. It's a maybe. It's a 20% chance and a slightly better than 20% chance. But this is also precisely the stage at which every historically destructive hurricane looked exactly this unremarkable. If either of these systems does manage to survive the wind shear gauntlet and make it as far west as the Lesser Antilles, that's where things start to get serious, because that's when it enters warmer water and potentially calmer upper-level winds, the exact fuel a storm needs to intensify quickly. And that region between Cabo Verde and the Caribbean is not some random patch of ocean. Meteorologists call it the Main Development Region, the MDR, and it's the birthplace of nearly every long-track, high-intensity hurricane in Atlantic history. Some of the most devastating storms ever recorded in this basin, storms that reshaped entire coastlines and are still studied in emergency management courses today, began as exactly this kind of wave rolling off West Africa in the first 2 weeks of August. And that's not a coincidence, that's the climatology of this exact calendar window. Before we go any further, if this kind of breakdown is useful to you, drop a comment and let me know what you want tracked next, because I genuinely read everyone, and hit that subscribe button if you want to stay ahead of these systems before the news outlets even pick them up. It helps get this information in front of more people who need to see it before landfall, not after. Let's talk for a second about how a system actually gets classified once it does start organizing, because this matters for understanding why forecasters use the language they use. Once a tropical wave develops a closed circulation and sustained winds under 39 miles per hour, it becomes a tropical depression. Once those winds cross 39 miles per hour, it earns a name and becomes a tropical storm. Once sustained winds reach 74 miles per hour, it's a hurricane, and from there it gets ranked on the Saffir-Simpson scale, Category 1 through Category 5, based purely on sustained wind speed. Category 3 and above is what forecasters classify as a major hurricane, the threshold where wind alone starts to cause catastrophic structural damage, and that's the exact number that both NOAA and Colorado State University have slashed for this season. Remember, they went from as many as 3 major hurricanes predicted back in the spring down to as few as 0 to 2 now. But wind speed is honestly only half the danger. The other half, and arguably the more lethal half historically, is storm surge, which is the wall of ocean water a hurricane physically pushes ashore ahead of it. Storm surge has been responsible for the majority of direct hurricane deaths in the United States over the last several decades. More than wind, more than tornadoes spun off from the storm, more than inland flooding in a lot of cases. So when you hear a storm downgraded from a hurricane to a tropical storm right before landfall, that headline can actually be misleading, because the surge threat doesn't downgrade with it. Some of the deadliest storms in American history made landfall as relatively weak systems on the wind scale, but pushed catastrophic surge inland regardless. Now let's zoom out, because there's a bigger story sitting underneath all of this, and it's the reason forecasters have been repeatedly walking back their hurricane season numbers all summer. There's a powerful, strengthening El Nino sitting out in the Pacific right now, and it is having a direct, measurable, suppressing effect on the entire Atlantic basin. Here's the mechanism. El Nino years produce dramatically higher wind shear across the tropical Atlantic and Caribbean, and as we just talked about, wind shear is the #1 killer of developing hurricanes. So this year, the 2 biggest hurricane forecasting bodies in the country have both been revising their numbers downward pretty much every single month since spring. Back in April, Colorado State University put out their initial call for 13 named storms, including 6 hurricanes and 2 major hurricanes. Then in June, they trimmed it. Then in July, they trimmed it again. And now, as of their August 5th update, they're all the way down to 9 named storms, 4 hurricanes, and just 1 major hurricane for the entire season. NOAA has followed almost the exact same trajectory. Their original outlook back in May called for 8 to 14 named storms with 1 to 3 major hurricanes. Now, their most recent update has that range collapsed down to just 7 to 13 named storms, 2 to 6 hurricanes, and 0 to 2 major hurricanes. And they've actually raised the probability of a below-average season all the way up to 75%. To put that in context, a normal Atlantic season, averaged out over 3 decades, produces about 14. 4 named storms, 7, 2 hurricanes, and 3, 2 major hurricanes. So what we're looking at right now, statistically, is a season that could end up producing roughly half the hurricane activity of a typical year. If that actually holds, it would only be the second time in the last decade that the Atlantic has failed to reach above normal activity. So far, this season has produced exactly 2 named storms. Tropical Storm Arthur formed in mid-June in the warm water off the Texas coast, in that stretch of the Gulf everyone's now calling the Gulf of America, and it dumped record-breaking rainfall across portions of Louisiana, while spinning off tornadoes along the Gulf Coast. Then Tropical Storm Bertha followed, also forming in the Gulf, originating south of the Florida Panhandle before making landfall in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana. Neither one was a hurricane. Neither one made major national news for more than a couple of days. And that's actually the whole point of what I'm about to tell you, because this is where the story gets genuinely dangerous. Every single hurricane forecaster, every single meteorologist who's spent their career tracking these systems says some version of the exact same sentence every year. And it's not a disclaimer, it's not a legal cover-your-back statement. It is the single most important sentence in all of hurricane forecasting. It only takes one. It doesn't matter if the season produces 7 storms or 17 storms. It doesn't matter if the total accumulated cyclone energy for the year comes in at half the historical average. None of that matters to the people living in the path of the one storm that does form, intensify, and make landfall in a populated area. Go back and look at the history books. 2016 was not considered an especially remarkable hurricane season overall, and then Hurricane Matthew came through in October, one of the strongest storms to hit the southeastern United States in over a decade. And people in eastern North Carolina are still talking about the flooding it caused. 2018 was a similar story, and then Hurricane Michael showed up, a storm that intensified so fast right before landfall that entire coastal communities in the Florida Panhandle didn't have time to fully prepare, and it went down as one of the strongest landfalling hurricanes ever recorded in the continental United States. And more recently, Hurricane Melissa, another late-season storm that formed well outside the peak window most people associate with hurricane season, tore through the Bahamas and the Caribbean, and left behind enough destruction that its name will almost certainly be retired and never used again. And that name retirement process itself tells you something important about how history remembers these storms. Every year, the World Meteorological Organization maintains rotating lists of storm names, reused every 6 years, and the only time a name gets pulled off that list permanently is when a storm was so deadly or so costly that reusing the name would be considered insensitive. Names like Katrina, Harvey, Maria, Michael, they don't come back. And it's worth remembering that both Katrina and Harvey, two of the most catastrophic hurricanes in American history in terms of both lives lost and economic damage, both formed in the month of August during this exact stretch of the calendar we're sitting in right now. That's not me trying to scare you for the sake of it, that's just the climatology. August is when the ocean has had the entire summer to store up heat, and it's when the statistical odds of something big forming go up dramatically compared to June or July. Here's what makes right now, specifically, the moment to actually be paying attention instead of tuning this out as background noise. We're entering the busiest stretch of the entire Atlantic hurricane season. June and July are historically the slow months, and then August flips a switch. About 25% of all named storms in a typical Atlantic season form during the month of August alone, and nearly 30% of all hurricanes form during this exact window. The season officially runs from June 1st through November 30th, but the real engine of activity kicks in from about mid-August all the way through late October, and with the statistical peak of the entire season landing on September 10th, almost like clockwork, every single year. So the timing of these two new disturbances forming right now, right as we cross into this ramp-up period, is not a coincidence. This is exactly the part of the calendar where the ocean has had all summer to warm up, where the Saharan dust that tends to choke off storm development earlier in the season starts to thin out, and where that main development region between Africa and the Caribbean becomes the most productive hurricane factory on the entire planet. Let's talk for a second about what actually determines whether one of these current disturbances survives its trip across the Atlantic, because it's a genuinely brutal gauntlet. First, it has to clear the Saharan air layer, which is this dry, dusty, stable layer of air that gets kicked up off the desert and can suffocate a young storm before it even gets started, cutting off the moisture and instability it needs to build thunderstorms. Then, assuming it survives that, it has to deal with wind shear the entire way across. And this year, that shear is elevated specifically because of the El Nino pattern sitting in the Pacific, meaning storms forming this year are statistically more likely to get torn apart mid-journey than in a typical season. And even if a storm manages to survive both of those obstacles and reach the warm water closer to the Caribbean, it still has to contend with dry air intrusion, with interaction from other systems, and with the simple bad luck of moving over cooler patches of ocean at the wrong moment. So when you hear that a system only has a 20% chance of development, understand that's not forecasters being cautious for no reason. That's the actual physics of how brutal this journey is for a young tropical system in a year like this one. But here's the flip side of that, and this is the part that should genuinely keep your attention on this story over the coming days. If a storm does manage to survive that gauntlet, if it makes it through the dust, through the shear, and out into that warm open water past the Lesser Antilles, it now has almost the entire rest of the basin in front of it to intensify. And an El Nino year doesn't erase that risk, it just concentrates it. Fewer storms doesn't mean weaker storms. In some historical El Nino years, the storms that did manage to survive actually intensified rapidly once they cleared the shear, because the ocean heat content underneath them had been building with less competition from other systems drawing down that energy. That's what meteorologists call rapid intensification, when a storm sustained winds jump by 35 miles per hour or more within a 24-hour window. And it's become one of the single biggest challenges in modern forecasting, because it can turn a manageable tropical storm into a major hurricane bearing down on a coastline with almost no extra warning time. Michael did it. Several of the most destructive storms of the last decade did it. So this isn't a story about relaxing. This is a story about watching two specific systems over the next 7 to 10 days and understanding that the odds of either one becoming something historic are genuinely low, but not zero. And low odds have been wrong before, repeatedly, throughout hurricane history. If you've made it this far, do me a favor and hit that like button, because it genuinely tells the algorithm to put this information in front of more people who live along the coast and need to see it before something actually forms, not after it's already making landfall. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because I want to know how many of you are actually in a coastal zone right now tracking this with me. Let's shift now to the other side of the planet, because while the Atlantic has been the quiet basin all summer, the Western Pacific has been doing the exact opposite. And there's a really important connection between the two that most people watching Atlantic hurricane coverage never even hear about, Right now, there's a storm called Typhoon Dolphin that has been absolutely tearing through the western Pacific. And at its peak, it reached super typhoon status with sustained winds over 165 miles per hour, which is the equivalent strength of a Category 5 hurricane on the scale we use here in the U.S. The storm blew past Japan's Ryukyu Islands with howling winds strong enough that U.S. military bases on Okinawa ordered all personnel to stay indoors under an emergency readiness condition. It then continued tracking toward China's eastern seaboard, and while it weakened somewhat before making landfall in Zhejiang province, it still brought damaging winds and a serious flooding threat to that entire coastal region. And this isn't an isolated event. The Western Pacific Basin has already produced more than double its season-to-date average in what's called accumulated cyclone energy, which is basically the total wind energy output of every storm in the basin combined, double the average. That's an extraordinarily active typhoon season happening in real time, while the Atlantic sits there, producing barely 2 weak tropical storms. And the reason that matters, the reason I'm bringing this up in a hurricane tracking video, is because it's not a coincidence. El Nino doesn't suppress tropical activity everywhere on the planet equally. It reshapes where the energy goes. The same atmospheric pattern that's choking off Atlantic development with all that extra wind shear is simultaneously loosening the leash in the Western Pacific, warming water in that basin and reducing the shear that would normally keep storms in check over there. So think about it like this. It's the same amount of chaos on planet Earth, it's just been redirected. The ocean and atmosphere aren't producing less overall energy this year. That energy simply got rerouted toward a different part of the globe. And right now, Asia is absorbing the hit that the Gulf Coast and the eastern seaboard are, for the moment, being spared from. And the downstream effects of Typhoon Dolphin haven't stopped at China's coastline either. The storm has been enhancing what's called the southwest monsoon over the Philippines, dumping significant rainfall across Metro Manila and more than 20 provinces, triggering landslides, downed trees, and flash flooding in multiple regions. A separate low-pressure system, which developed into Tropical Depression Maymay, crossed directly over northern Luzon, becoming the Philippines' 13th tropical cyclone of the year, and the second one specifically in the month of August alone. Local authorities in Baguio City logged more than 30 storm-related incidents in a matter of days, from fallen trees to soil erosion to damaged power and water infrastructure. And forecasters there are already warning that 2 to 4 more tropical cyclones are expected to develop within or move into their area of responsibility before August is even over. Meanwhile, in Thailand, that same enhanced monsoon pattern tied to Dolphin has raised flash flood risk significantly enough that maritime authorities issued warnings for small boats to stay ashore in the upper Gulf of Thailand and the Andaman Sea. So while American coverage this week has largely been about a couple of disturbances that might maybe possibly form off Africa, an entire region on the other side of the world has been dealing with a genuine, ongoing, multi-country weather emergency. And it's barely making a ripple in Western headlines. It's worth pausing on just how different the response infrastructure looks in a situation like this, compared to what a coastal American city would deploy for a similar threat. In the Philippines, a country that gets hit by an average of 20 or more tropical cyclones every single year, entire government agencies exist purely to manage this rolling cycle of monsoon enhancement, tropical depressions, and flash flooding. Because for them, this isn't a once-a-decade emergency, it's a recurring monthly reality for a third of the year. That's actually a useful comparison point when you think about preparedness in general, because the places on Earth that experience this kind of weather most frequently tend to have the most normalized, almost routine response to it, while places that go multiple years without a direct hit, exactly the kind of complacency an El Nino season like this one can create, tend to be the least prepared when their turn finally comes. So here's the strategic read on all of this, the part that connects everything we've talked about so far into one bigger picture, because I don't think enough people are actually making this connection. What we're watching right now is not two separate weather stories, an Atlantic story and a Pacific story. It's one global pattern with two different outcomes depending on geography. El Nino years train Americans, especially people along the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic seaboard, to relax. The forecast numbers come out lower, the news coverage gets quieter, and there's this creeping sense that maybe this is the year nothing happens. But that exact same pattern that's giving the Atlantic a break is actively fueling one of the most intense typhoon stretches the Western Pacific has seen in years, which tells you something important about how these systems actually work. The suppression isn't permanent, and it isn't uniform. It's redistribution. And every single meteorologist who studies these patterns will tell you that a slow start to the Atlantic season, especially one driven by El Nino-related shear, does not guarantee a slow finish, because that shear pattern can relax as the season progresses, especially once you move past the statistical peak in September and El Nino's influence on the deep tropics starts to wane heading into the fall. Some of the most destructive Atlantic storms in history, Matthew, Michael, Melissa, all formed later in the season, closer to, or even after, that September 10th peak, in years where the shear had finally relaxed enough to let something spin up fast, and by the time it did, coastal communities had already mentally checked out for the year because the forecasts all summer had told them to. That's really the risk hiding underneath a below-average forecast. It's not that nothing will happen. It's that when something does happen in a year where everyone's guard is down, the response and the preparation lag behind the storm because nobody expected to need it. So if you live anywhere along the Gulf Coast, the southeastern U.S., or up through the mid-Atlantic and into New England, the message here isn't panic. It's actually the opposite of panic. It's the same message every coastal emergency management agency puts out every single year, regardless of what the seasonal forecast says. Prepare exactly the same way you would in an active season, because the forecast tells you the odds across the whole basin over 6 months. It does not tell you what happens to your specific zip code if one storm decides to take a hard right turn in week 11 of the season. That means the basics still apply no matter what the numbers say. Know your evacuation zone before you need it, not during the 48 hours before landfall when everyone else on the road is also trying to figure it out for the first time. Keep a few days of water, food, and any essential medication on hand at all times during the season, not just when a storm is already in the forecast cone. And understand that the cone of uncertainty you see on every hurricane graphic only represents where the center of the storm is likely to track. It does not represent the full width of dangerous conditions, which routinely extend far outside that cone on both sides. Let's bring this back to those two disturbances one more time before we wrap up, because that's really the live story developing as we speak. Over the next few days, expect the tropical wave currently over West Africa to move off the coast right on schedule Tuesday, and expect the National Hurricane Center to keep issuing updated formation odds as it does. If that shear gap holds and the storm manages to organize into a tropical depression, that would put it on track to become the season's next named system sometime in the middle to latter part of next week, right as it's crossing that central stretch of open Atlantic. If it doesn't organize, and honestly, given the current odds, that's still the more statistically likely outcome, then we watch the next wave that comes off the continent after it, because in August, during the peak development window, there's always another one behind it. That's the rhythm of this time of year. Wave after wave rolling off Africa every few days, most of them dying quietly over open water, a few of them finding that gap in the shear and turning into something that ends up with a name, a forecast cone, and eventually, in the worst cases, a permanent spot on the retired names list next to Matthew and Michael and Melissa. I'll be tracking both of these systems as they develop over the coming days, and if either one gets upgraded to a tropical depression or a tropical storm, that's going to change the entire conversation. Because that's the point at which we start talking about an actual forecast track instead of a formation probability. So if you want that update the moment it happens, subscribing genuinely is the fastest way to make sure you see it. Because these systems can go from a 20% chance to a fully formed hurricane cone in a matter of just a few days once conditions line up. What do you guys think about all this? Do you think this El Nino pattern holds all the way through the peak of the season and the Atlantic actually ends up staying this quiet? Or do you think we're looking at a slow start before something eventually breaks through in September or October, the way it has in so many of these historically underestimated seasons? Let me know down in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear your read on it, especially if you're watching this from anywhere along the Gulf Coast or the East Coast where this actually matters to your week-to-week planning. And if this kind of breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening out there instead of just seeing a scary headline with no context behind it, do me a favor and share it with someone you know who lives in a coastal area. Because the more people who understand this pattern before the peak of the season hits, the better prepared everyone ends up being when it actually counts. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll be back with an update the moment either of these systems takes its next step toward becoming something real.